Before the ships, before the chains, and long before the stories of captivity filled the history books, there was another truth. Buried, silenced, and nearly erased. Across the shores of early America, free African men and women built homes, cultivated land, and lived lives of dignity long before slavery was forced upon their people. Yet their legacy was stolen, their names erased, their stories replaced by lies that painted them only as captives. But history doesn't stay hidden forever. Imagine discovering records, maps, and testimonies proving they were here, free, strong, and thriving. What happens when the truth finally emerges? And what does it mean for everything we thought we knew? The story of America, as it has been told in classrooms, books, and films, often begins with an image of enslaved Africans stepping off ships, stripped of freedom, dignity, and history. For centuries, this version has been accepted as the beginning of black presence in the Americas. But what if that narrative was incomplete? What if long before chains and plantations, Africans were already here, free, independent, and shaping their own destinies? This forgotten truth is not simply a correction of facts. It is a revolution of perspective. The idea that black men and women lived in the Americas as free people before the institution of slavery challenges deeply rooted beliefs. It forces us to re-examine the foundations of American history, to acknowledge the erasure, and to face the uncomfortable reality that their freedom was deliberately silenced. To understand how this erasure happened, one must step back into a time when the New World was still a mystery to Europe. The earliest explorers who touched American soil did not come alone. Alongside Spanish, Portuguese, and even English expeditions, there were Africans, some sailors, some skilled navigators, some craftsmen, and some servants who had earned freedom through generations. Their presence was not rare. It was recorded, though often hidden in the margins of journals and maps. In 1526, nearly a century before the first shipload of enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Spanish colonists attempted to settle in what is now South Carolina. With them were Africans, some enslaved, yes, but others free. When that settlement collapsed, many of those Africans disappeared into the landscape, merging with indigenous peoples, forming alliances, and creating small but resilient communities. Their story rarely appears in textbooks, yet it marks one of the earliest footprints of free Africans in what would later be called the United States. Beyond this, there were the Moors, African-descended people from Spain and Portugal, who arrived during the Age of Exploration. Some came as navigators, trained in mathematics and astronomy. Others were translators, merchants, or skilled workers. They were not enslaved. They were essential. Their knowledge of sea routes, agriculture, and survival in foreign lands was critical to European expansion. Without them, some voyages would never have succeeded. But as European powers entrenched themselves in colonization, the narrative began to shift. Freedom for Africans became an inconvenience to the emerging system of profit built on bondage. To justify slavery, it was easier to erase the presence of free Africans altogether. If history portrayed Africans only as slaves, then their enslavement seemed natural, inevitable, even justified in the twisted logic of the colonizers. This erasure was not accidental. It was intentional. Colonial records were edited, stories rewritten, and oral traditions ignored. Generations grew up believing Africans arrived only in chains, when in truth, some had walked the soil of America freely, decades and even centuries earlier. Imagine then, a young researcher stumbling across forgotten documents in an archive, the pages yellowed with age, the ink fading, yet the story unmistakable. References to free African farmers trading with native tribes, notes about black sailors guiding European ships through Caribbean waters, records of African families owning land long before plantations took root. Each discovery is a spark, threatening to burn down the false narrative that has endured for centuries. The deeper you dig, the clearer the truth becomes. Africans were here before slavery. They were free. They contributed to the shaping of this land in ways history books never admitted. But this truth was dangerous. To acknowledge it would unravel the myth that justified centuries of oppression. It would force the world to recognize not just the resilience of enslaved people, but the deliberate theft of an even earlier legacy, a legacy of freedom. The setup of this story is not merely about uncovering facts. It's about exposing a lie that has lived for generations. The lie that Africans had no place in America until chains dragged them across the ocean. The lie that Black history begins with suffering rather than strength. And so, the stage is set. A hidden history waits to be told. A story of free Africans whose existence challenges the very foundation of what we think we know about America's past. The curtain lifts on a history long buried. The setup revealed the existence of free Africans in the Americas before slavery, but the rising action digs deeper into how these lives unfolded, how they built, resisted, thrived, and how their stories were systematically erased. The Forgotten Settlers in 1526. The Spanish explorer Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón led hundreds to the coast of what is now South Carolina. Among them were Africans. Historians believe some were enslaved while others had earned or purchased freedom. The colony collapsed quickly due to disease, hunger, and conflict with indigenous groups. But in the chaos, a group of Africans disappeared. They did not die with the settlement. Instead, they fled into the wilderness, seeking refuge among native tribes. Here, a remarkable fusion began. Africans and indigenous peoples exchanged knowledge, farming techniques, hunting strategies, spiritual traditions. Oral histories from some southeastern tribes speak of dark-skinned allies who arrived long before English colonists ever stepped onto Virginia's shores. These alliances weren't mere survival strategies. They laid the foundation for hidden communities that endured for generations. Africans in exploration. When we picture Christopher Columbus or Ferdinand Magellan, we often imagine exclusively European crews. But shiplogs tell another story. Africans, especially those with Moorish backgrounds, were integral to navigation. They were mathematicians, cartographers, and interpreters who guided vessels across unknown waters. In fact, the famed navigator Estevanico, an African from Morocco, was among the first non-native men to explore vast portions of the American Southwest. In the 1520s, he traveled through Florida, Texas, and into Arizona and New Mexico, long before English colonization. Estevanico was not a shadow in history. He was a pioneer, a cultural bridge, and at times a leader. His story complicates the narrative. He was both enslaved and respected, both exploited and relied upon. He embodied the duality of being African in the early Americas, needed for knowledge, but rarely acknowledged as equal. Landowners and farmers by the early 1600s. Africans in places like Florida and Louisiana were farming, trading, and in some cases, owning land. The Spanish crown even granted rights to Africans who converted to Catholicism, allowing them to marry, baptize children, and build communities under Spanish law. In St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest European established city in the U.S., Africans were present from the very beginning. Some records reveal African men who not only farmed but petitioned for legal recognition of their rights. Others fought in defense of Spanish settlements against European rivals. These were not powerless individuals. They were builders of society. Yet their contributions rarely appear in the sweeping narratives of early America, the birth of erasure. So why does the average history textbook still begin Black history with Jamestown, 1619? Because acknowledging Africans as free citizens before slavery threatened the ideological foundation colonizers were laying, slavery required a justification. To maintain it, colonists crafted a myth. Africans had always been slaves, were naturally suited for bondage, and contributed nothing beyond forced labor. The existence of free Africans dismantled that myth entirely, and so erasure began. Records were rewritten, accounts minimized, documents left to decay. Over generations, the memory of free Africans was scrubbed clean. The enslaved narrative became total. Resistance. Through memory, but memory has a way of surviving where written records fail. Among indigenous tribes of the Southeast, oral traditions speak of African warriors who married into their communities, of children born with African features long before plantations dominated the land. Among descendants of the Gullah and Geechee people along the coasts of South Carolina and Georgia, cultural practices reveal layers of African traditions that predate mass slavery. Folklore, language patterns, and even agricultural techniques hint at an African presence deeper than the colonial timeline admits. Even in Catholic records, tucked away in dusty European archives, lies evidence, Baptisms of African children born free in the Americas before the first cargo of slaves reached Virginia. As colonization deepened and profit became the sole measure of value, freedom for Africans became a liability. If one African could own land, why not another? If one could intermarry with natives, why not many? If one could farm independently, what would stop hundreds from doing the same? The colonial powers could not allow it. Laws were passed restricting African rights. Spanish leniency hardened under pressure from English competition. Free Africans who once held land were increasingly forced into servitude. Intermarriages were outlawed, children reclassified, property seized. Slowly, the memory of freedom dimmed. By the mid-1600s, the institution of slavery had swallowed nearly every avenue of possibility for Africans in the Americas. The human cost of silence. Yet the silence was never complete. Imagine a young African child in the 1700s, born into bondage, hearing whispered stories from elders. We were free once. Our people walked this land before the chains. To the masters, such stories were dangerous. Rebellion lived in them. But to the enslaved, they were seeds of dignity. Every act of resistance, from secret worship practices to uprisings, carried the weight of that memory. Freedom had existed before. Freedom could exist again. The researcher's discovery fast-forward centuries. A modern researcher, sifting through overlooked archives, begins to piece the puzzle together. Each fragment, ship logs noting Moorish navigators, land grants to African farmers, records of African native marriages, reveals not just isolated incidents, but a pattern deliberately concealed. This discovery is not just academic. It is personal. It is an act of reclaiming identity. For millions of African Americans taught that their ancestors' only role in America was through chains, this history shatters the narrative of inferiority. It restores dignity stolen by centuries of omission, building toward the climax. The more evidence emerges, the more the narrative cracks. Historians debate, institutions resist, and skeptics dismiss the findings. But the truth grows undeniable. Free Africans walked American soil before slavery. They were navigators, farmers, landowners, and allies of native tribes. Their erasure was not fate, it was strategy. Their legacy is not myth, it is history. The rising action swells with tension. A truth hidden for centuries is on the edge of breaking free. The question becomes, will the world accept it, or will denial bury it once again? The hidden pieces of history had been scattered for centuries, records buried in European archives, oral traditions whispered among tribes, fragments of memory carried in the songs and stories of descendants. But when the truth finally begins to surface, the impact is explosive. The collision of narratives for generations. The foundation of American history had been carefully constructed. Africans arrived in chains in 1619, and their story began in bondage. It was a narrative that supported the myth of white supremacy and justified the centuries of exploitation that followed. But the growing evidence of free Africans before slavery struck like a hammer against that foundation. What happens when a lie repeated for centuries collides with undeniable truth? A reckoning, historians argued fiercely. Some dismissed the findings as anomalies, outliers not worth reshaping the larger story. But as more documents surfaced, land deeds with African names, baptismal records of African children born free, accounts of Estevanico leading expeditions into the Southwest, the resistance grew weaker, and yet the opposition was not simply academic. If the world acknowledged that Africans were here before slavery, then the myth of inherent inferiority collapsed. The justification for centuries of cruelty would be exposed as deliberate deception. The breaking point, imagine a modern-day lecture hall. A researcher stands before a crowd of students and historians, presenting the evidence. On the screen, a Spanish record from the 1500s naming Africans as settlers in Florida. A shiplog noting Moorish navigators steering vessels across the Atlantic. A baptismal entry recording a free African child in St. Augustine decades before 1619. The room buzzes with disbelief. Some faces beam with excitement, others scowl with discomfort. And then comes the question that hangs in the air like a storm. Why weren't we told this before? The answer is devastating. Because someone didn't want you to know. The weight of erasure. The climax is not just about uncovering facts. It is about confronting the system that buried them. Each piece of erased history was an intentional act of control. To erase Africans as free settlers was to strip away their humanity, to make it easier to shackle them, to silence their children, to convince generations that bondage was their natural state. But the truth refuses to stay buried. Every rediscovered record breathes life back into the silenced voices. And the sheer weight of those voices now crashes down on the present, demanding to be heard. The emotional earthquake for descendants of enslaved Africans. The revelation is more than academic, it is personal. A grandmother sitting in her living room watching a documentary about free Africans in America feels tears roll down her cheeks. Her whole life she was taught her people's story began in chains. Now she learns her ancestors once walked this land free, proud, and unbroken. A young man scrolling through archives online finds the name of a free African farmer in Louisiana, dated decades before slavery was codified. The man's last name is familiar, eerily similar to his own family name. He realizes he may be tied to a lineage of freedom his teachers never told him about. This is the climax's power. It transforms shame into pride, despair into strength, silence into voice. The clash with denial, but revelation does not come without resistance. In public debates, some historians argue these were exceptions, not the rule. Why does it matter? It matters because one exception shatters the myth. One free African before slavery is enough to dismantle the lie that black people were born for chains. And there weren't just one, there were many. Settlers, navigators, explorers, landowners. Erased, but not gone. The denial is loud, but the truth grows louder. Newspapers run stories. Schools begin to question their curriculums. Descendant de mon recognition. And the walls of the old narrative begin to crumble. The symbolic moment picture this moment. A historian presents Estevanico's story, the African explorer who walked across the American Southwest in the 1500s, to a packed hall. She shows a map of his route, stretching thousands of miles, and then she asks the crowd, if this African man was one of the first to map the land that would become the United States, why is he not celebrated alongside Columbus or Magellan? Why is his name not in every textbook? The silence in the room is deafening, because the truth is undeniable. Estevanico was here. Africans were here. They were here before slavery, before Jamestown, before the myth was born, the human confrontation. The climax sharpens as we imagine the confrontation between truth and power. On one side, centuries of lies fortified by institutions, textbooks, and public memory. On the other, a rising wave of evidence and the voices of people reclaiming their stolen past. It is not a polite academic debate. It is a cultural earthquake. Each truth revealed rips another hole in the fabric of false history. The old narrative trembles under the weight of evidence. The turning point. The breaking point comes when the evidence can no longer be dismissed as scattered anomalies. It is a body of proof too large to ignore. Africans were not passive shadows waiting to be enslaved. They were actors in history, explorers, builders, allies, long before chains defined their existence. And once that truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be taken back. The climax lands with full force. The myth has been shattered, and history will never be the same again. The moment the truth finally breaks through, there is no going back. The myth that Africans arrived only as slaves has been punctured. What follows is not just a rewriting of history books, it is a rewriting of identity, dignity, and belonging. Reclaiming what was stolen. The discovery of free Africans in early America does more than expand the historical record. It restores something immeasurable, the right to see oneself not as a product of chains, but as a descendant of pioneers. For centuries, black children in classrooms were introduced to their people's story with the image of ships, whips, and auctions. Now, with this truth revealed, that starting point shifts. They can learn instead that Africans stood tall in this land long before oppression sought to break them. They were builders, navigators, and settlers. They carved paths that even the conquerors followed. This restoration of pride reshapes the self-image of an entire generation. The ripple in education schools begin to stir. At first, it's hesitant, an optional module in a college history course, a short segment in a high school textbook. But the pressure grows. Parents demand fuller truth for their children. Community leaders push for recognition of African explorers and settlers alongside European names that have long dominated the narrative. Imagine a future classroom where children open a history book and see Estevanico's name beside Columbus, his journeys mapped in bold strokes across the Southwest. Imagine students reading about free African farmers in St. Augustine or seafarers in Portuguese ships who helped chart the coasts of the Americas. For the first time, Black children look at the past and see freedom, not just chains. And white children, too, are taught a truth that dismantles dangerous myths of superiority. The effects ripple far beyond textbooks. A Black mother tucks her child into bed and whispers stories of free Africans who walked this land, stories she never knew until now. A teenager, often told he has no heritage to be proud of, stands taller as he learns of ancestors who thrived long before slavery. An elder who carried silent shame feels her spirit lift as she realizes her lineage was never just bondage. It was freedom stolen, but not erased. The psychological shift is seismic. The story no longer begins with pain. It begins with power. The resistance still lingers. But even as truth spreads, resistance does not vanish overnight. Institutions deeply invested in the old narrative push back. Critics argue that this new history complicates the story too much. Some call it revisionism. Others dismiss it as irrelevant to the broader sweep of history. Yet each attempt to silence the truth feels hollow. Once evidence is seen, it cannot be unseen. Once the story is told, it cannot be untold. And the more resistance appears, the more it proves the power of what has been revealed. The healing power of truth for centuries. Erasure inflicted wounds that were not visible but deeply felt. Wounds of shame, silence, and invisibility. By restoring this hidden chapter, healing begins. Communities organize festivals to celebrate early African settlers. Museums curate exhibits on African explorers who shaped the Americas. Descendants trace their family names and realize their ties to free Africans long before bondage. The truth brings not just recognition, but joy, a reclaiming of dignity long denied. And healing is not just for the descendants of the erased. For all of America, this truth forces a reckoning. It reminds the nation that its story was never singular, never simple, never the property of one people alone. The broader lesson beyond history, there is a lesson about power. Erasure does not happen by accident. It happens because someone benefits from it. Lies endure because they serve systems of control. And truth, when it rises, disrupts those systems. The revelation of free Africans in early America is not only about the past, it is about the present. It forces a question. What truths are being hidden now? What stories are being buried because they threaten power? The impact is a call to vigilance, to question what we are told, to dig deeper, to listen to voices silenced. The long-term consequences and the truth spreads. Its impact multiplies across generations. In education, curriculums expand. Children learn a more accurate, richer story of America's beginnings. In identity, Black pride deepens, rooted not just in survival, but in original freedom and contribution. In culture, art, literature, and film retell these hidden stories, giving voice to the erased. In justice, acknowledging deliberate erasure fuels ongoing fights for equality, reminding the world that history's lies have consequences in the present. The shift is not just historical, it is cultural, spiritual, and political. The closing reflection at the heart of this resolution is one undeniable truth. The story of Africans in America did not begin with slavery. That was not the beginning, it was an interruption. The beginning was freedom, movement, and contribution. To know this is to walk differently, to carry history differently. To look at the soil of America and know it, once held free African footprints before it ever bore chains, and that knowledge is liberation in itself. Final takeaway, the impact of rediscovering hidden history is more than rewriting textbooks. It is rewriting lives. It restores dignity where it was stolen, truth where lies were planted, and voice where silence was enforced. The story of free Africans before slavery is not just history, it is a key to the future. It reminds us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to rise. And when it does, it has the power to heal, to transform, and to set generations free.